It's finally here. The new cheese grater. The
Can't innovate anymore, my ass.
round 2. The new Mac Pro. Now, you've probably seen a lot of unboxings already of this thing on YouTube, but this is not an unboxing, because why take it out of the box when you can take the box out of it? This is an unveiling. Let's pull this thing apart and see what's inside. The case, assembled in the United States of America, is already a little bit unusual because there's a handle on the top where you can twist it and open the machine. That's not something that most of us Apple users are used to, including on Apple's other Pro products, like iMac Pro. But twist this handle you can, and you see that the case actually raises itself up on the frame a little bit. I'm a little bit disappointed. It's kind of a scratchy rotation. It doesn't feel quite as good as I would expect, but the case lifts straight off, and you are presented with the computer. Now that's the back side. This is the front side. And as you can see, we got the base model, the $6,000 version. There's a reason we got that, and I'll explain that later in this video and later in the week. But if we go back to the main chassis here, there's really only one thing. This is a pretty dumb little aluminum box. You'll notice that there's no dust filters, interestingly. Apple said that they didn't need them. They've gone on record saying that, so we'll see if that holds up. And then you'll note that there's 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports, but they're not actually in this part of the chassis. They're mounted inside the frame. You'll also note that there is a power button, and that is something that communicates with the main case through this little copper connector right here, as well as these 4 pogo pins that are on the case itself. And so if the case of the Mac Pro is not closed, the machine will not turn on. So you're going to need these 4 pogo pins that illuminate the power indicator, allow you to turn the machine on, and then you've got your 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports right there. Other than that, I guess we start where? Around back, the stuff that you can actually replace pretty easily. If there's anything that Apple has allowed end users to replace in the past, it's memory, or RAM, and Mac Pro is no exception. They're covered by these 2 little shrouds. You might be wondering why those are there, and the answer is really quite simple. Cooling. Through these little holes, cold air is sucked into the computer case, along with the main compartment big, large intake fans, and then all of the hot air from the entire system is exhausted by this blower-style fan in the back of the case. So these are to help direct airflow. But if you need to access the memory slots themselves, you just pull this little latch, and this little door swings open, which you can remove, and reveal one of 12 memory slots. Now, the 12 memory slots can be populated against all of the CPU models that Apple allows you to configure your computer as. Because I got the base model, I only have 4 DIMMs of 8 gigs each. So pretty low-end spec, but you can add more memory, and Apple actually even shows you how to do it so that you can put them in the proper channel configuration on the back of these little shrouds, which is pretty nice. Their own website actually tells you how to mix and match memory sizes as well if you choose to do that, which is pretty nice. It is 2933 megahertz memory, which is pretty high-end. It's actually the fastest clock speed that these Intel Xeon W chips support, and my core model, unfortunately, only supports the lowest RAM speed, but the rest of the models should support a higher speed. Now, what you might not notice, and what Apple doesn't really say is user accessible, but technically from a physical level it is the SSD, which you can find right there. Now, I only have 1 of them. If you have a larger configuration, you'll actually find that the drives are in RAID 0 and therefore very, very, very fast. And these are the exact same SSDs that are inside the iMac Pro. Now, the reason I say they're not user accessible is because while I can get access to them and remove them, they're keyed, they're not soldered, they are tied to the T2 chip and authenticated specifically to this machine. What that means is if I go on eBay and find an old iMac Pro SSD, it's not going to work. The only way you can upgrade and replace these SSDs are directly through an Apple authorized service provider, which is really pretty annoying. But I have a pretty sneaking suspicion that you're going to be able to upgrade storage on your own using the SATA ports and PCIe slots inside the case. Stay tuned to this channel and get subscribed so that we can kind of check that out later this week. Now, this main compartment is really where stuff gets exciting, because at the end of the day, this is an open modular PC. A weird one, but a modular PC nonetheless. It's weird in part because there are PCIe slots, but not just any number of PCIe slots, 8. That is more than double the standard ATX motherboard in PC land. This is a massive motherboard with tons of expansion capabilities. One of the slots is pre-populated, and this will be the case in all of the models, by Apple's weird I/O card. So on this card, you'll have 2 USB-A ports, 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports, and a headphone jack. Then at the very bottom of the case, you have 2 10 gigabit Ethernet ports built into the motherboard right next to the power supply. And then above that, whatever GPU you configure from Apple and any other PCIe slots that you decide to add on your own. Now, what's unusual and a little bit interesting about the way Apple did this was that it's so, in fact, encouraging users to add their own cards and modify them that Apple provides numbers on how to add and remove cards from their chassis. Now, in classic Apple fashion, this is done really, really nicely. There are captive thumb screws, so you don't have to worry about cross-threading or losing stuff. It pops right out, nice and easy. And this is really where I think stuff is pretty special. This latch, not only is it cool because of the way it sounds, listen to this. It's not just because of that, but it's also because of the way that it works. On a standard graphics card, or really any PCIe device in a PC, you have this little hook here. And this hook is there so that it stays attached to the PCIe slot inside your motherboard. Now on the PC, they have these little shoes that come over the top. But the problem with these shoes is that if you are in a really tight computer case, or if you have a bunch of other cards on top or nearby, it's oftentimes really difficult to access these little shoes to release the PCIe device or graphics card from your computer. It must appear that Apple thought of that because this switch is a master release for all of the PCIe cards. And rather than hook from the motherboard itself, it just uses these little hooks above to hook down into the graphics cards or PCIe devices. It's so Apple. I mean, it's not really anything inherently unique, or, well, it is unique. I don't know that it's special. It's not that advanced of a system, but it's just one of those things that only Apple would have thought about. Looking at a standardized norm and thinking, why don't we do that better? And they did. This slot is awesome, and I want all of my PCs in the future to have it. I don't think that'll happen, though. Now let's get to the other weird innovation in these machines. So let's unlock that. Oh, I could hit that switch all day. That is so cool. We have this little plate here, which locks this side of the cards. You might be wondering, this side of the cards, and yes, by the way, these are all captive thumb screws. That's because behind this plate is the MPX modules. Now, in a standard graphics card, you have one PCIe slot, be that PCIe X8 or X16. Most modern GPUs are X16, but you have one PCIe slot, and then if you need external power, which basically all graphics cards require, you need to power the device through external power headers or connectors. Now Apple, in a surprising turn of events, has actually supported this open standard. So if you want to use your own GPUs, you can. You do need to buy what is an $80 cable kit from Belkin, which allows you to use these power headers on the motherboard. But there are Molex power headers. They look like really, really tiny PCIe connectors that allow you to supply power to external graphics cards and other PCIe devices if you need power, which is really freaking awesome. But if you're using Apple's GPUs, which most of us are, let's release this one. You ready? So here's the number 4. We push this. This little lever comes out. Oh, that's a magnetic lever. It's so over-engineered, but so awesome. And if you pull it, the card releases. You can pull it straight out, and you'll see our regular old Radeon 580X graphics card. Whoa, looks pretty weird. And that's because here you have your standard PCIe X16, and then over here you have your MPX, which is used for external power. And then in the case of some of the higher end GPUs that Apple has, like the dual Vega 2 cards, these are actually used for data as well, as far as I'm aware. Which is pretty unique and pretty excellent. This thing is heavy as crap because it is just a big, massive heatsink on top of the GPU. There is no active cooling on this GPU, unlike basically every other off-the-card graphics or off-the-shelf graphics card available, which means that this thing really should operate silently like the rest of the computer. Now, if you look at the PCIe slots, the MPX slots themselves, there are 2 MPX slots. Some of the graphics cards that Apple sells are dual height because they run so hot, because they're quite literally 2 GPU dies on the same card. They need a lot of cooling. And so they'll actually be double height and cover 1 or 2 of these slots depending on your configuration. But if you have the standard 580X or a regular GPU, you'll have access to 7 technically, because this I/O card will probably stay in PCIe slots, which is really, really cool. Let's talk the power supply, because that is also removable. And it's also fully, well, if I can find this thing here, there's one screw, that's a little annoying. It's fully replaceable by the end user, and it's fully sealed, which is nice. The iMac Pro and the iMac have big, open, scary, exposed power supplies, which are very dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. But this is not the case. This slides right out, and this allows you to, well, remove the power supply if it ever goes bad. This 1,000 watt 80 plus platinum power supply is available on every Mac Pro model, and that's one thing that's important to note. Other than CPU, GPU, RAM, and one other thing, what was it? Oh, SSD. Everything is user upgradable, or I should say everything is standard. So whether you buy the $6,000 Mac Pro or the $52,000 Mac Pro, all the hardware other than those four components, CPU, GPU, RAM, and storage, are exactly the same. Power supply, 1,000 watts, and that's really, really cool. One other interesting thing is this is vented, ported, presumably, for cooling, and there's a big gasket that connects it to this left compartment right where the blower style cooler is. So all of the heat from the power supply will get sucked out of the PSU and exhausted out of the back of the case without it ever heating up this inside compartment because it's gasketed off. That's a really cool design. You have your power connector here. This PC is looking, well, pretty well empty, but we can still remove more. Not technically under what Apple suggests users do, but when have we ever done what users are suggested to do by Apple? Let's keep going. Active cooling in the Mac Pro is very unusual, at least if you're used to building PCs. Rather than use active fans on your CPU cooler and on your GPU, everything is passive save for the 3 intake fans in the front and the 1 blower exhaust fan in the back. Now these things are attached with 6 screws. There's one here in the corner, there's 2 up here at the top, and then there are 3 in the back, which are right here, and right here. Once you've found these weird 6 seemingly randomly placed screws, you can pull the fans straight out of the case. Maybe. There we go. And they slide right out. Now the nice thing about them is they are pressure fit. There's no cables, no connectors you have to worry about. You just see them right there, there, and there. Now the actual fan design is really unique. And look, I'm not a thermal engineer, so I couldn't explain why they did this, but I would presume that part of the reason the fans are designed the way they are, wherein the blades don't actually run against the shroud, the whole entire shroud spins, is to reduce the kind of vortex of air where you have really rapidly spinning parts which are rigid next to areas that don't make any noise. Generally in the PC crowd, you'll note that the less severe the fan profile, the quieter they are. And I think Apple just mitigates this entirely by having the entire fan shroud rotate around the chassis. It's a weird design, but it is really freaking quiet. And these things, partially probably because of how thick they are, bring in a lot of air through the case and exhaust out the back. You put your hand to the back, even where it's not exhausting air, and there is a big heavy stream of airflow, and the computer is basically silent at a standstill. The question is, can it keep all of this hardware cool and under its thermal constraints? That I don't know, but from a quiet standpoint, it passes the test. I've been trying to decide how best to remove the CPU cooler to get to the CPU, and in my hunt, I have discovered this. What is this thing? It looks like another RAM module, right? Well, it isn't. If you pull this very scary, you pull it very firmly, you can pull it straight out, generally, and what will reveal itself is none other than a speaker assembly for Mac Pro. Yes, Mac Pro has a speaker and a subwoofer. Why would you want to use this? I don't know, but it's there. A lot of people said this, the Mac Mini has a speaker too, a very, very tiny one, and people say, oh, well, it's for the boot chime. No, it isn't. There is no boot chime in macOS anymore. So this is truly just to listen to some crazy good tunes through your $6,000 speaker, Mac Pro with a speaker. All right, so this is presumably the socket backplate or the Mac equivalent. The thing is, these are always a little scary because you can get your chip slightly misaligned when reinserting. But this time around, I found something that I haven't seen on any prior Mac, and that is that behind this little shroud for the CPU cooler, there are 2 very, very deep screw holes that at the bottom house Torx T15 screws. Now, I got a screwdriver that was way too large for this hole. It was the only one I had, so please bear with me. Who needs the paint on the inside of those holes? I mean, it doesn't affect cooling. And let's get to loosening it and see if we can pull this cooler off and get to the chip underneath. There's unfortunately no repair guide on this, and that's really the problem with this Mac Pro, is most of it, as you can see, is user accessible. You can remove this stuff without much difficulty. But Apple's guides and instructions really only support replacing RAM and the power supply and graphics cards. Beyond that, you're basically expected to be on your own. And that's a little bit unfortunate. With a machine that's so easily accessible and with an architecture that's intended to serve pros, why not let the pros get what they want and provide full service and instruction manuals for them? There you go, we got our beefy cooler to come up. It's basically the LTT black edition of the Noctua, what is that called, NH15? It's a very beefy cooler, and you can actually see that there are 8 heat pipes throughout this chip. So this is a very beefy, probably overkill cooling solution for this 8-core chip that we have, but it will definitely come in handy for the 24 and 28 core variants. And there it is, the CPU. Let's get a closer look. Rather than a traditional heavy-duty socket door that you would find on a PC, we kind of have this wire system, which I've actually seen in a few server installations before, so Apple wasn't the first to invent it. But if you pull that off, then we have access to the chip itself. And holy moly, this thing is a monster. This is probably the largest, least efficient 8-core chip there ever was. Now let's look at the actual model number, because the whole Intel Xeon W lineup is a bit weird. Apple seems to have chips not available to other manufacturers, and also chips that Intel doesn't even have listed on their own site. All right, it looks like this chip is the Intel W3223. The Intel Xeon lineup has 2 8-core options. This is the lower end of the two, making it just about the bottom of the barrel in Intel Xeon W lineup. This chip, the tray price is about $750. You better believe Apple paid a lot less than that. But the good thing is that there's nothing too inherently special about this chip or others. And so you should be able to basically drag and drop any of the chips supported by this chipset into Mac Pro and not have any other issues. I did this with iMac Pro and it worked great. Next up, we have something that kind of surprises me. We're on the back of the machine again, and we have this fairly substantial heatsink, and I thought surely underneath it must be the Intel chipset for this CPU, but it's actually not. That's on the front of the motherboard. This is marked, but when you do a web search for it, not much information comes up on it. I presume it to be either a PCIe switch for your devices or a power controller, since all of the external power is routed through the motherboard rather than handled directly by the power supply unit. Interesting nonetheless. There's not much left inside of this machine. All we have left is this tiny little door cover. And the purpose of this is pretty simple. It's covered by these very, very small Torx T5 screws. And they cover this little panel, which is a pressure fit mount for these ribbon connectors. And these ribbon connectors just go up to our little module, which holds the Thunderbolt 3 ports, as well as the power LED and power button. So that's all the bandwidth for those. Those are just flush mounted. You can pull those up with a spudger, and then that's basically it. We just have to remove the motherboard. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the 2019 Mac Pro. There's a little bit of flex in that motherboard. Partially because the motherboard is gigantic. I've seen a lot of desktop PCs in my day, and none as big as the motherboard in here. This is truly the size of a server motherboard. It's ginormous, not just because of 8 PCIe slots, but because all of the power is controlled through the board as well. It's quite beautiful, and there's a number of interesting chips that you might, want to take a look at. So behind this little heat spreader, I suppose, is a number of CPU VRMs. This doesn't seem like a great way of spreading heat, but I don't know. I guess it does. Then again, Apple has never really focused on VRM cooling, but they are all right here. Down here, you'll note that there is an Apple T2 chip. So this is obviously the SSD controller, and it also handles some of the Thunderbolt throughput. It handles boot security and a number of other things. You have your Intel C621 chipset right here. This is obviously the motherboard chipset next to the motherboard's CMOS battery. You have your power headers we talked about earlier. There's 2 down here, 2 up here, and then 1 at the very top. And then over here, you have two SATA ports, which are easily accessible inside the case, which is kind of cool. But unfortunately, you also need SATA power when running a hard drive or an SSD. And it uses this weird 10-pin proprietary connector that it seems, at least at point of recording, Apple only sells with Pegasus's hard drive caddy insert, which runs $400. There's also a USB 2.0 header, and this is for a lot of pro applications like Avid and other pro workflow apps require a hardware serialized key or license. And so rather than having that hang off and dangle off the back of your computer, you can just insert it here and forget about it. On the back, well, there's not that much. We have that chipset that we talked about earlier that needs to be actively cooled. Again, I'm not really sure what this is. iFixit didn't know either. They called it a PCIe controller, and that's probably accurate. I also expect it to be a power controller, given that it's actively cooled. And a couple of other just minor small things over here. These are your two Aquantia 10 gigabit Ethernet LAN chips that need to be cooled. They're cooled passively through the frame of the case. And then you have your 12 RAM slots right here. And other than that, that's basically all of the important stuff on the motherboard. A large motherboard it is, but it better be given the large price of this machine. Apple announced a little hilariously during the keynote that this computer would be available with wheels. Not such a bad idea for a computer that's so heavy. But when the order page went up, people found out that the wheels cost $400. I obviously didn't buy them. I'm sure many people didn't. But what's even crazier is that if you didn't buy the $400 wheels when you purchased the computer, you would have to send it into Apple if you ever decided to upgrade your wheels. Now, most people, myself included, thought that this meant that the entire frame was either created with wheels or without wheels, and a full computer disassembly would be required. That's not the case. There's just a 4mm hex screw that you can remove yourself and then pull the foot right out. These are definitely user removable. Now, I have the whole entire computer disassembled. If you had it all put together, you could still do it. There's enough clearance in a regular hex wrench, but it is a little bit of a hassle. But are the feet removable? You betcha. I hope I can put this thing back together. This machine is absolutely overly engineered. To give you a good example of this, this is a PCIe bracket cover from a high-end server. In fact, what was a $30,000 server a couple years ago. This is just stamped steel, and watch this. Bends immediately. The one Apple uses is milled aluminum. It is half the weight of this thing, and I'm not kidding. I can get it to bend barely after an extraordinary amount of pressure. It's just absolutely absurd, because when you look at the sum of the parts, this machine's price starts to make a little more sense. Now, I'm not saying that it's a good value. I'm not saying that if you're going to spend $6,000 like me, you should go get this spec. You probably shouldn't, and you would likely be better served with an iMac Pro. I'll talk about that in an upcoming video soon. Apple charges more to upgrade the CPU than Intel recommends that retailers charge for a brand new one. RAM is still extraordinarily expensive. This is not a budget computer, and it's not a great value. But if you need a Mac Pro, a really high-end one, not only is this a decent $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 computer, but it's a really cool one. Well, folks, that's all for me. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you didn't, that other button seems to work okay too. We have some crazy, as this thing sits in pieces, we have some crazy videos planned for this machine, assuming I can get it back together. So stay tuned and get subscribed. And as always, stay snazzy. See you later, folks.